Okay, today's lesson is Basics 4 for the caregiver class, and it is called Communication with the Person Who is Living with Dementia. And our resources are this new book by, let me get it, called Pathways to Wellbeing with Dementia by Dementia Action Alliance. And my co-teacher and I do have articles in that book, but that is one of the sources that we have used, and we'll be including on our email, a follow-up email to those of you who are in our active class right now. We'll be getting you information of how to order that book. We are also drawing from Melanie Bunn, who is Dementia Alliance of North Carolina dementia educator, from Tifa Snow, a very well-known dementia educator internationally, from Helen Whitworth, who some of you, especially those who are dealing with LBD, has written a number of books that have been very impactful and helpful. And of course, Lynette and I have put our own stuff into all of this as well. So lots of sources for today's lesson. And I'm going to start us off here with an introduction by asking you kind of rubber meets the road question. Fundamental question to start with. When you're communicating with a person who is living with dementia, do you want to correct or do you want to connect? Do you want to correct them or do you want to connect with them? I'm hoping you're choosing the second one. Connecting with them is what it's all about. And so as you're doing that, if you'll kind of keep in the back of your mind a couple of overriding goals for all of your communication with them. Number one, preserve the personhood of that person who's living with dementia. Preserve their personhood as much as you can. You're kind of the protector advocate for them. So if you'll put that as number one, as your goal. Number two, try to have and create as much of a gentle journey as you can for them, for you, for your family, for everyone. So if you'll follow these two goals and keep them in the back of your mind all the time, to try to preserve personhood, to try to create a more gentle journey, these are going to create a completely different experience of the disease for you and for them. Because there's the disease, and then there's the experience of it. And you can't change the fact that the disease is there, but you do have a lot of control over what that experience is going to be. And today's lesson has a lot to do with that. So let's dive into it. My part right now is to pretend I'm the person living with dementia. And so I'm going to say some things to you that they may be thinking, that they may be saying. This is where we think they're coming from. I'm still me. I have the same likes. I have the same personality. Or maybe the opposite personality. Okay, I'm forgetful. I'm slower, but I can still do things. I'm rational. Got to think about that one, don't you? But this is what they're thinking. I'm an adult. I deserve respect. Communication is challenging for me when I can't find the right words. My vocabulary gets lost. My mind goes blank. My sentences can just derail. I have difficulty projecting my voice sometimes. And sometimes I might even stutter. When I'm talking to my friends, I often lose my train of thought. I can't keep up. I can't stay on track. People often talk too quickly, and they don't give me enough time to talk. I have something to say. I just need more time and less distraction. I process fewer of your words now. Even in the early stage, I might not hear one out of every 4 words that you say to me. In the moderate stage, I might lose my consonants so that I only hear vowels. I am absorbed in my own stuff, my view, my feelings, my needs. And I also add your feelings to mine, and I can combine them into one big muddled patch of feelings. So your body language and your facial expression likely matter more to me a lot of times than your actual words do. I might act out in an aggressive or an agitated way, and I might actually be in pain physically or emotionally right then. But when it comes to pain, I may not even feel it. But I can act out when it happens because my brain is registering that pain. I just can't feel it, maybe. And it might be something as light as a little discomfort because my belt's too tight. If I'm back in time when I ask about my mother, my thoughts are about her, if she's okay, or that I want to see her. Can you just reassure me about that in some way? I don't need to hear that she's dead all over again. Okay. How many of those things sounded familiar to some of you? There are a number of truisms that pop up when people have dementia, not all for every person, but a lot of commonality. It's common for the person living with dementia to say or do things that are inappropriate. If you remember, for those of you who were with us for the first lesson in this series about the brain and dementia, one of the things we talked about was that there's an area of your brain that has some preserved function in. And that's the area that most of us have at least know exists, because it's the area that where music is preserved. And I think we've all seen things on YouTube or TV or wherever about people who can sing or who respond to sound, to songs long beyond when they can do verbal things in any other way. So we know that's preserved. But guess what else is there that's also preserved? Racial slurs, curse words, and sex talk. So you have some things that are more difficult, along with music that's very positive. As a person living with dementia, I may not respond in the way you expect. I may say things that don't make sense, sometimes using something called word salad. And word salad is using words that are, in fact, true words, but having them jumbled in such a way that they make no sense to anybody else. I can give you an example from my experience with Roy. I kept a list of things he said or did over a period of time, and this is one of the things from those lists. He said, he uses the kumbaya stick and the do's that go with the don'ts. I have no idea what any of that meant. And he looked at me, and what are you going to say? But that's word salad. All of those were words, but they're just mixed up in such a way that they make no sense in the way that they're put together. The person with dementia may use words that are close to what they're trying to say, but that aren't quite on cue. For example, they may call a book a newspaper. Another example of this from Roy is that he loved music, and I put on some music one day by David Lamott, who happened to be a singer that he knew a little bit, but I was telling him, this is David Lamott singing, and his grandfather was Louis Lamott, who happened to be one of Roy's favorite professors in college. And Roy looked at me and said, "Oh, he was one of my misters." So the use of the word Mr. instead of professor. They may repeat themselves or not remember instructions. They may deny what you know is true, and conversely, state as true what you know is false. They may appear irritated, scared, or too personal. Sometimes it's those sexual issues that come across as too personal, and it may be inappropriate words. And with a few people, it may be inappropriate touching. Remember when that happens, that the frontal lobe, this front part of the brain, is affected early in dementia in almost all the kinds of dementia. And that part of the brain controls our impulse and our reasoning, and it creates the filter through which our thoughts go and our words go. So when the frontal lobe is not working well, not only have we lost the impulse control, but we've lost the rest of the filter for our speech. There may be thinking errors. As Pat said, as the person with dementia, they believe the first information they receive because they cannot evaluate it and make decisions about it. And again, that evaluation process is in the frontal lobe of the brain also. They process fewer words. If English is the secondary language, they may go back to speaking in their primary language. And all of these things happen when the person still looks pretty much like they've always looked. They don't look sick. And that makes other people who don't hear all of this happen all the time wonder if the person's really sick and has something going on. And it makes caregivers wonder if they're the ones that have the problem. We need to remember that there's always a consequence when communication is poor, even if it's a small consequence. And those consequences may range from getting no response from the person living with dementia to a catastrophic behavioral meltdown. All of this makes figuring out how to communicate with a person with dementia even more important and more challenging. As Pat said, the goals of communication are to preserve the personhood of the individual with dementia and to make the journey more gentle. I want to talk just a minute about personhood because this applies to all of the things we'll be saying about how to approach communication. Personhood implies recognition, respect, and trust. Acknowledging personhood means that we recognize their needs, their wants, their emotions, their personality, their relationships, and their life story. Melanie Bunn, whom Pat referenced earlier as a dementia educator, says, communication is the glue when other things start to fail. So how do we approach this communication? You know, communication occurs all the time, and it occurs no matter what the degree of dementia is. Remember that the person living with dementia often has abilities that fluctuate from day to day and from hour to hour. That's because, again, as we talked about when we talked about the brain is shrinking. As the brain shrinks, the synapses, these are the synapses that are the ends of the nerves that communicate with each other. As the tissue shrinks, those synapses get pulled further apart, so that message has further to travel. The message is carried from one synapse to the other by neurochemicals, and those neurochemicals also decrease in production. So you've got two different things going on that interfere with communication and that make it difficult to predict how well one is going to communicate at any given point in time. So sometimes how you approach communication works, and sometimes it doesn't. The ability to communicate decreases if the person is sick or doesn't feel well. If with some kinds of medications that they may be taking, and as dementia progresses. Communication, again, is about making the connection. It's not about whether what you're communicating about makes sense necessarily. So to start in trying to establish good communication, you need to look first at the environment. Make sure it's quiet and that it's calm. That may mean that the TV's off and that there are not a lot of people in the room at the same time. And that you have good lighting. People with dementia have visual changes that mean that shadows can be misinterpreted more easily as holes or as objects or as people. And any of that is more distracting. You don't need to put the person under a spotlight, but think about how the shadows play out in the room where you're trying to communicate. Before you do anything, stop and observe the person closely. Speak to them first from about 6 feet away. And thanks to the pandemic, we all know what the distance of 6 feet is without any problems. Let them know you're there. You might say, knock, knock, or hi. Look then for whether they recognize you, what kind of facial expressions they have, any physical indications that they might be in any kind of discomfort, and what kind of mood they're in. If they seem to recognize you, which many people with dementia do throughout the course of the disease, identify them by name, by the name that you usually use for them. Hi, Daddy. Hi, Mother. Or what I used with Roy, hi, sweetheart. If they don't seem to recognize you, you may want to try calling them by their first name. Remember that the first names were the first things we heard being called by. So as the brain goes back in time, that may be what they remember being called. If they don't seem to recognize you, make sure that you also identify who you are. For instance, you might say, hi, Jimmy, it's Mary. Always approach the person slowly and from the front if possible. Be aware of those visual changes. As dementia progresses, our vision goes from being able to see way out here on each side and gradually closes in. So that by mid-dementia, what they may be seeing is the equivalent of looking through binoculars. If I'm looking through binoculars, I can see what's straight in front of me, but I can't see out to the sides. I can't see what's below me or above me, that peripheral vision that we all use all the time. If they can't see you, then you're likely to scare them if you come up unexpectedly. And when many of us get scared, we jump. And the jumping can be interpreted as the person trying to hit out at you when all they're doing is reacting to the fact that they didn't have any idea you were anywhere around. Try to sit at their level as you talk with them and maintain eye contact. Nobody likes for somebody to stand over them to talk. You may want to touch them if it's appropriate. Physical contact always conveys interest, and it can provide reassurance. Use positive nonverbal communication, which is your body language and your facial expression. I want to go back and touch on something that we talked about last month when we talked about communicating with other people, and that's that only about 7% of our communication is verbal, of what we hear and understand. Only about 7%. It's not very much. About 55% of what we're trying to say is communicated through our body language. That says a whole lot to me, no matter what anything else comes out of your mouth. And about 38% of what we communicate is through our tone of voice. Nonverbal communication conveys how we really feel about a situation. If the verbal communication and the nonverbal communication contradict one another, the nonverbal communication is what will be believed. And the person with dementia may be even more reliant on nonverbal communication than you or I because of their slowness of processing and difficulty understanding at times. When we talk about body language, we're also talking about tone of voice. Try to be friendly, not bossy or critical, not condescending. The tone you set plus the emotional memory that's evoked by your present or the words you're saying equals what the person is going to hear. Watch the pitch of your voice. Deeper is better. Think about the volume. What's the first thing you do when somebody doesn't seem to understand you? You talk louder. Assume that it's a hearing problem. Again, when we look at the brain in dementia, the parts of the brain that process what we hear don't shrink. They don't change very much in dementia. So we don't need to talk louder to someone. Think about your speed of speech. Try to be slow and easy, not pressured and not too fast. And then the rest of body language includes your posture, your facial expressions, eye contact, hand gestures. Try to stay calm, open, look interested. And again, you may touch the person if that's appropriate. One of the pieces of information I found fascinating, actually, in doing some research is that human beings read facial expressions in as little as 17 milliseconds. That's literally quicker than the blink of an eye. And when you think about somebody coming into the room, especially if somebody comes into the room and they're upset, even more so if they're upset with you when they come in the room, you know at the minute you get the first glance at their face. Try to stay in the moment. You can't be perceptive if you aren't in the moment, and certainly you can't respond to what they're trying to convey if they can't convey it clearly if you aren't in the moment. The results of a study from Harvard shows that we miss out on 50%, and this is not the person living with dementia, this is all of us, miss out on 50% of our lives by not being present. Okay, so what do I do if I want to get this person living with dementia to do something? Give a short, direct message about what's happening. Let's go to the bathroom. Let's go to the table. Put on this shirt. Give simple choices when you can. Typically, the best thing to do is an either or. Use visual cues when it's possible. For example, holding up, would you like to wear the red shirt or would you like to wear the blue shirt? So that I've got the visual cue there in addition to the words that I'm using. Ask them to do something to help you. Many people with dementia enjoy simple things like folding laundry, even well into their disease process. And you know your person with dementia better than anybody else, so you can probably come up with some simple things they can do to feel like they're being helpful and useful. Ask them to give something a try. Would you try walking to this chair for me? Break down the task and give it one step at a time. Here, let me pull down your pants. Sit here. Tell me when you're finished. so that they don't have to remember all the steps in a process, which is probably very difficult for them. And only ask them, are you ready to whatever, if you're willing to come back later, because the answer to that question is always going to be no. And the classic example of that is asking someone to take a shower or bath. Are you ready to take a shower? I can tell you what Roy's response was. One of two things, either no, or I've already done that. And one of the caregivers that we have was probably the fastest thinking one on her feet that I've ever seen. He said that one day to her, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Wilson, we found out there were problems with the water this morning, and it's fixed now, and everybody who took a shower before we got it fixed has to take another shower." Maybe you can think that fast. I'm not good at coming up with that quite that quickly. Okay, so what do you do when a person is distressed or frustrated or angry? If they can't tell you what's wrong, their needs probably fall into one of two categories, either physical needs, they're tired, they're in pain, they're uncomfortable, thirsty, hungry, too hot, too cold, need to pee or have a bowel movement, or have already done that and need some help getting clean. Or their emotional needs. They may be afraid, lonely, bored, angry, or excited about something. Try to figure out what it is they really need or want. Try saying things like, "It sounds like you're really tired," or "It looks like you're angry," or "It seems like whatever," or "You're feeling whatever." You may need to use sentences that are even more simple than that. Are you cold? Are you tired? Ready for bed? So that there are fewer words to process. If the person is angry or frustrated, use empathy, not forced reality. Say, "I'm sorry you're upset," not, "There's no reason for you to be this upset." Both my words, my tone of voice, and my posture convey something completely different. And as Pat will talk about more later, "I'm sorry" is one of the best phrases any of us can hear when we're in a difficult situation. Once they give you some indication, if they're upset, that they're listening to you and responding, then you can try to redirect their attention to something else that they like. It might be an activity that they like, listening to music, or a treat like ice cream works every time for me, or a snack. So what happens? You've gotten this far and the person has responded to you. So now what do you do to keep this going? Make sure you stay positive, friendly, praise them when you can, again, using short sentences and being specific about what you're praising them for. Offer your thanks and your appreciation for any efforts they've made to do something, even if it wasn't 100% correct. Laugh with them and appreciate their attempts at humor and friendliness. Roy never lost his humor during his whole journey. He liked to joke and he liked to play jokes, and he still always had the twinkle in his eye through the whole process. One of the stories that I really like, probably my favorite one with his, is happened just a couple of years before he died, and he still could tell us that he needed to go to the bathroom some of the time. And he had indicated he needed to go to the bathroom, so I took him in the bathroom. And I was very mindful of the fact that the 2 days preceding this, when I took him to the bathroom, he had peed on my feet. And fortunately, it was summer and I had on flip-flops and, we could handle that. But this particular day, I had on tennis shoes and I really didn't want him to pee on my tennis shoes. So I got his pants down and said, "Okay, Roy, we're at the potty. You can sit." Okay, but he stood there. So I patted the seat of the potty and said, "Roy, the potty's right here. Sit." Okay, nothing happened. I took his hands loose from the bars that were on each side to help him get up and down, and then put them back on that, because that frequently would cue him as if he had just arrived at the potty. And I said, "Okay, Roy, you can sit down now." Okay, nothing happened. By then, I was really convinced that my shoes were going to get a bath. And I was running out of patience just a little bit. And I said, "Roy, sit." He sat down. Then he looked up at me and went, "What? What?" I didn't care at that point in time whether he peed on my shoes or not. I laughed, he laughed, but that person that was still him, and that humor and being able to appreciate that was still there, very much so. Touch can be very comforting, but you need to be careful about it sometimes. Sometimes a person doesn't want to be touched, even if it's something they've enjoyed in the past. There are times when we're all irritated or angry that we don't want somebody coming up and touching us physically. Again, this person better than anybody else. So you can probably read whether touch is appropriate or not. If you're going to have just a friendly, casual interaction with a person with dementia, remember to go slow and go with the flow. We've talked in the past about the need to be an improv actor when you're a dementia caregiver. That means that no matter what they say, you can pick up and say something back in response to it that goes along with where they are. Remember that the way they see things is the way that they are true for them, whether that's the way you see them or not. Acknowledge their emotions. "It seems like," or "I can see you are." Use familiar words and pictures and cues again to help direct them. And those familiar words are very important. One of the nurses that Roy had after he had a traumatic brain injury and was in the hospital, grew up in France. And when she came to the United States, it took a while for her to get her nursing license here. And in the interim, she told me she had worked being a sitter and a caregiver in homes while she was waiting on that licensure to come through. And she said one night, the man that she was a sitter for said to her, "I got to take a leak." And the only leak she knew was the leak you eat. So she went to the refrigerator, opened it, looked around, didn't see anything, went back to the man and said, "We don't have any leaks." And he said, "No, I got to take a leak." She went back to the kitchen again, looked all around, couldn't find anything, went back to him again and said, "I'm sorry, there are not any leaks in this house." At which point in time he said, "Never mind, it's too late." So being on the same page with words helps a whole lot. And again, as the caregiver who knows your person better than anybody else, you know what words they're familiar with. Be prepared to have the same conversation over and over. If you haven't already done that, that will happen. Always try to look interested and friendly. Don't argue with them. Remember that they are very concrete. They can't process information and sort it and evaluate it anymore. So they believe what they believe. Be prepared for some emotional outburst if the conversation moves to something that they don't want to do and you don't agree. But remember all the time that they are doing the best they can, just as you're doing the best you can as a caregiver. There's two specific entities that I want to talk about for just a second before I turn it back over to Pat. One of those is something called Capgras syndrome, CAPGRAS, and I see heads nodding. Some of you are familiar with that. Capgras is really a visual defect, seems to be related to the way the brain interprets faces. But what it is an irrational belief that someone they know has been replaced by an exact duplicate or an imposter. Usually the person that they're around the most is the one who becomes the imposter. If you think about the fact this is a visual defect, you can use your voice to help compensate for that. Before you come into a room, you may start talking to the person before they ever see you, because they may well recognize your voice and know it's you when you actually appear. We also had a caregiver who had what I thought was an ingenious suggestion that had worked with her husband, which was that she would call her husband on the phone when her daughter was there so she could help him. And the daughter would say, "Oh, mom's on the phone," and hand him the phone. And while he was talking to his wife on the phone, she was in the hall, thank goodness for cell phones, and walked into the room while they were still talking on the phone. And that worked well for them in his recognizing that she was who she was. The other thing I want to mention is therapeutic fibs. We want people to say things that are correct. We want our children to do that. We want to do that. And we want the person with dementia to do that also. And many times they will say things that aren't correct, or they will ask questions that you really don't want to give them the answer to. For example, Roy frequently asked whether I had talked to his mom that day. Well, his mother had been dead for 20 years. And my response was, "Nope, haven't talked to her today." Or how his mom and dad were doing. They were doing fine the last time I saw them. Not really telling a lie, but there's no need to say to him, again, as Pat pointed out in her opening remarks, that your parents are dead. For many people, that will throw them back into some of the emotional turmoil that they felt when that person died initially. Okay, so remember Pat's original question. As you think about this, do you want to connect or do you want to correct? Okay, I'm going to do a little share screen here. And I want to share Teepa Snow's 5 ways to say I'm sorry. So give me a minute to get to that place. Okay, here we go. Teepa Snow, I think it gave us a real jewel with this one. And I think we have for this, you don't need to write these down. We're going to be sharing. There's a sheet that we're going to share with you when we send the link to this lesson. And so you won't have to worry about getting that. But when you're in a situation where things are just, that your loved one is just off or feeling bad or something has happened, it's important to get over yourself and just to say, you know what, I just I just need to say I'm sorry. And here are 5 different ways that you can do that. I'm sorry. I was trying to help. I'm sorry that I made you feel angry or irritated or frustrated or sad or isolated. This is really speaking to what their emotional state is. It really doesn't matter so much the details of what happened. You go to the feeling of the person. I'm sorry that I made you feel that way. And this really is whether you did it or not. Doesn't matter whether you did it or not. You're trying to remember, you're trying to connect with them, and you're preserving their personhood by doing this. A third way, I'm sorry I made you feel like a child. I'm sorry I made you feel stupid or like an idiot. I'm so sorry for that. These kind of things go a long way to helping the person be able to process that emotion that they're feeling at the time and get past it. A fourth way, I'm sorry that happened. And it's from their perspective. I'm sorry that happened to you. That's just awful. I'm so sorry that happened. And here again, it doesn't matter whose fault it was. You're just sorry it happened. And the fifth way, I'm sorry. This is hard. I hate this for you, but this is hard. And it really is, you're saying it to yourself as well as to them, because it is hard. And so we are going to share that with you. I'm going to stop the share now and go back to the group. But those tools are really, really helpful. So I'm wrapping this up here. You've heard a lot of information today. Let's boil it down to, at your house, what are their stressors? What are their triggers? What are the things that you are dealing with? Reflect on how this looks at your house. Think about it. Give it some time when you get a little bit of time. What are the things that really cause bad stuff here? And then when you've gotten some time to process it and think it through, make every effort to avoid those. This is being perceptive. And then the avoidance part is being very proactive. You're trying to outsmart, what I call outsmart Louis. You're trying to outsmart the disease. I named the disease Louis because John had Lewy body dementia. So if you can outsmart Louis by figuring out what's going on, getting ahead of the game, having some techniques in mind that you might use if it comes up again, it's going to give you a sense of empowerment. It's going to give you a sense of more control for what's going on. And if what you're doing is not working, stop. Stop it. Don't keep repeating it. We all do that, okay? So I'm preaching to me too. But try to make yourself stop it and say, you know what, this isn't working, and here I am doing it again. Stop. Back off. Give him, her, and you some space and some time. Decide what you're going to do differently next time, and then just try again. It's what it's all about. Hang in there. So thank you for what you do. This is the end of the lesson now. So let me stop the recording, and we're going to open this up.